It's a very exciting day. Rob's book is launching today. You can go and buy it now. But before you do, listen to this podcast because we're going to talk about the book and obviously share the content within it. Like we do on the podcast, we always want to give you more. We're doing that in this episode. I can't wait to get into it.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. In case you don't know, we run a company that buys more than £100 million worth of property every year. You can find out about that at propertyhub.net/invest. But yes, on the side, on my weekends and very early mornings, I write the odd book. My latest one is out today, and I'm trying to convince you that maybe everything that you think about money is wrong. More about that in just a minute after today's news story.
So, Rob, so much exciting things to get into, but maybe just as exciting for you is one of your favourite subjects to talk about in the news story. It's like an unofficial birthday for you today, Rob. The Renters' Rights Bill moves forward to a key report stage. I don't know how you slept last night.
I can't get enough of this. It's amazing. The Renters' Rights Bill, of course, is the big shake-up to how properties are let, which is going to be the end of no-fault evictions. It means that tenancies are going to be indefinite and all kinds of other exciting things, which we've been talking about for literally years. But 2025 seems like, unless something very unexpected happens, it's going to be the year when this actually comes into effect. And the reason this is in the news again is that the next key stage to making that happen is going to be happening next week. It's what's called the report stage, which is where MPs go through the bill in detail, do all their final wrangling. Then there's one more stage in the Commons before it goes to the House of Lords. After that, it actually becomes law. So there are two big questions. One is, are there likely to be any major changes? We'll find out next week. I think the answer is likely to be no, because there's broad agreement about everything. The other question is, when is this going to come into effect? And I would say the best guess around that at the moment is towards the end of this year. By the time it's finished going through the process, then there needs to be a bit of time after they've published the final details for everyone to actually figure out how to implement it. But if, unlike me, you have not been paying attention to this so far, and you could be forgiven, 2025 is the year when you do need to start paying attention, because it's going beyond speculation, and this is actually going to become something that we're going to have to deal with day to day. So we will, of course, be keeping you updated on the podcast and in our free weekly newsletter, Property Pulse. So if you'd like to get all the latest property news in your inbox every Friday, you can sign up for that at propertyhub.net/pulse.
So today is an amazing day because writing a book is a massive thing. And I know this is Rob's fifth book. He's actually published more than five, but let's call it the big five. And this is his second book with Penguin, which is amazing. His last book was a Sunday Times bestseller. I've got big hopes, I'm sure you have, Rob, for this book as well. And it's a brilliant book. It moves away from property, but it's on a subject that is close to both of our hearts, which is economics. But I love how you've tackled this, Rob. While most of your books have been on property, this is about investment. But it's not just put some money away and you'll be fine for the future. In fact, it's far from that. It's, as we're going to get into, it's breaking down the norms of what is expected and what is suggested with money, with investment. And it's in the title, 7 Myths About Money. But it's not a great title and then weak content. In fact, I'm sure it was hard to come up with a title because what you've got in here really hasn't been talked about before. But when you get into it, and this is what I love about how you write, Rob, is you make it really easy and accessible to understand. And it's just like one of those common sense books where you go, huh, yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes absolutely sense. But why does nobody else talk about this? And that's why I think this is going to be a great success. But I'm also super happy that we're starting to take some of that content from that book and giving it to our wonderful podcast listeners. So before we get into some questions about the book, Rob, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling a bit nervous. And you might think that's a natural way to feel when you've got a book coming out. Actually, I don't. Normally, by the time it comes out, I'm very zen about the whole thing. It's like, I've written it, I've done the best I can. Now it's out there. Whatever happens will happen. But this time I'm nervous because this book is going against the mainstream in lots of ways and doing so far more than I ever have before. And I think listeners of this podcast are going to absolutely get it. And I think there'll be a lot of head nodding going on. But because this book is questioning lots of sort of long-held beliefs, when you start questioning people's beliefs, they're often not that happy about it. They react defensively. So I'm actually a bit scared about the broader reaction to this book. So I think parts of it will be a bit polarizing, but I feel like you've got to do it because, like you said, Rob, there is a lot of stuff out there. It's all quite samey and it's useful for some people, but it's not the whole story. And it's not the whole story for everyone. And it's certainly not the whole story with the way that the world is now.
Well, let's start with now. Why now? Why have you chosen now to bring this book out? And most of these concepts you've known for a while. It's not like you discovered a secret at the end of last year and put it down on paper. So why have you decided now is the time to bring this to the world and make that risk? As you say, put yourself out there and put out things that will make people feel uncomfortable and some people may disagree with as well. And that's really interesting because you've not really done that with a book before. You've come out with stuff that people can really get into and really understand and make sense and really helps people, but doesn't go against what's happened before. Whereas with this book, as you've said, it's going to make people feel uncomfortable. Podcast listeners, you're an exception. You're going to love this. But I'm really looking forward to the more general public reaction to this book. Because if I'm being honest, Rob, you're taking a bit of a risk here.
Yeah, it's true. With everything I've done in the past, unless you're the governor of the Bank of England, you'll probably be okay with what I'm saying. But this time, yeah, I'm going a bit further. And that links into the reason that I wrote this book now. Because we've talked a lot on the podcast in the past about your classic personal finance books like The Richest Man in Babylon and things like that. And the wisdom that's in books like that is timeless. It does still apply, but it's also about 100 years old at this point. And the world has changed a heck of a lot. The US central bank didn't even exist. And even when there was a spate of personal finance books, including Rich Dad, Poor Dad in the 90s, it was a completely different world that we lived in. And the reason that I think now is so significant is that 2022, no one really thinks about it now, but I think it will become to be seen in future as an absolutely pivotal year. Because that was the year when interest rates, which had been on a falling trend from basically the 80s onwards, so like 40 years of interest rates coming down, ending up at zero, suddenly rebounded back up to about 5%. And 5% is historically a normal level for interest rates to be, but it's not a normal level for interest rates to be when there's as much debt around as there has been. And that was some of the things I was talking about in my previous book. So I'll go into this in far more detail in the book, but I really do think that the implications that has for inflation, for how governments run their finances, for taxes, for the performance of various assets, I think the way that we need to think about investing, some of the decisions we need to make, and just the whole environment that we're likely to be investing within for the next couple of decades compared to the last couple of decades, it is completely different. And the typical advice that's out there may just not be enough.
It's definitely not enough. That's something that I'm sure of, and I know you are as well, Rob. Like, you might be polite, but it definitely is not enough. Let's do something now that we do in the podcast, which is always give more. We're not going to say you've got to buy the book to learn any of the lessons. Otherwise, this would be a pretty rubbish episode. Let's dig in. Let's take one of the myths. I want to start with the concept that there's an optimal way to invest. You've put this as a myth, and the idea is that there is no correct way to invest. And this is great because a lot of people get passionate about their one method of investing, and this is the way. I think you could point fingers at us because we're pretty passionate about property. But it's not the only thing we invest in. We're pretty big on property, I think that's fair to say, and our biggest exposure is to property. But there is no optimal way to invest for every single person out there, is there? There is no one path. And that's one of the myths that I really liked and resonated with me.
That's right. And because investment is about numbers, I think there's always been a belief that you can solve it mathematically. You can come up with like the answer. Here is how you get the highest possible return for whichever level of risk you're willing to take on. And that exact question has in fact been solved mathematically by someone called Harry Markowitz. He won the Nobel Prize for it. And it's what a lot of financial planning models are built on even today. But the way I approach this in the book is to say, well, that's great. That's really nice that you've been able to do all this fancy maths. But it has absolutely no relation to how people actually think about money, what people want to do with their money, how they think about investing in the real world. And a big part of the reason for that is that there's another very little known piece of academic research that I dug out showing that when people do anything with their money, they're basically trying to accomplish three different things. They want to protect their lifestyle. They want to make sure that if something goes wrong, they don't end up on the street. That's pretty obvious. And they also want to maintain their lifestyle and maintain that lifestyle even when they retire and when they're not working anymore, and just be able to have everything that they have now without working. Again, Pretty obvious. And if you go and talk to a financial advisor, those are the two things that they will talk to you about because that's what the typical models cover. But there is this third motivation, which is a motivation to improve. Everyone to some extent wants to get further ahead. They either want to have more than they have now, they want to leave a legacy, or they just want to get there faster. They don't want to be working until they're 65 plus. And that third motivation tends to get ignored. And the insight from the research is everyone has all three of these motivations all the time, but they have them in different proportions. So some people are super risk averse. They really just want to protect what they've got. And yeah, they'd like to improve a little bit. Some people are completely at the other end. And yes, of course, they're concerned with the retirement and all that, but they're also strongly motivated to make that big leap. So there's far, far more about this in the book. And I go into like how to figure out how to balance these motivations and how to invest accordingly and all that kind of stuff. But I just think that that core insight is really powerful and interesting, especially for the type of person who's listening to this podcast, because the very fact that you're thinking about investing in property, you're getting comfortable with taking on debt to buy property. All of these things are, to a large degree, in service of that third motivation, the motivation to improve. And by thinking in that way already, you're already drifting away from the mainstream models, because if you went and sat down with most financial advisors, they wouldn't be talking to you about property.
They wouldn't. And it's not a bash at financial advisors. For some people, they, as you've highlighted, Rob, it's great. It's absolutely perfect. But I think when you go to different financial advisors, they may say, oh, tell us a bit about yourself and we'll put a plan together. But it's like protein powder. There are different types of protein powder and different flavors, but it's still protein powder. And it's still the same advice. It's just different levels or different versions of that advice. Probably get a little bit of kickback from financial advisors from that. But really, for anybody listening who's spoken to one, and I have and I've engaged with one previously, that's what you get. And that, for some people, is absolutely fine. But for others, it may be not helpful. And actually, as far as completely wrong for what they want to achieve. But they are not in a position to recommend that type of strategy or risk because it's outside their zone. We're talking about chicken. You know, it's protein, but it's a whole different protein. I want to move on. It's January, Rob, so I'm very focused on health issues at the moment. But let's stick to the book before I write a book on health and protein. I want to move on to another myth, and I think this might be, we'll let people listening decide when they read it for themselves, but I think this might be the most controversial. For me, it's the myth that when I read the headline made me go, ooh, and this is the myth that compound interest will make you rich. Rob, this was meant to be the eighth wonder of the world, and you're challenging it. I mean, this is up there with the pyramids. I mean, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's Einstein on one side and me on the other. In fact, Einstein never made that quote, I found out while writing the book. There's no source from saying it's the eighth wonder of the world. But it is definitely something that everyone believes is super powerful. And it is. But I think there's a danger that compound interest, compounding returns, is presented as all you need. So if you just take the typical example of, just save 10% of what you earn, put it into a broad stock market index or whatever, and wait, by the time you're 60 something, you're going to be able to retire. It'll all be good. And to a large degree, that may be true. But again, coming to this book from the perspective of someone who has the interest and the desire and the willingness to go further than that, I think we can acknowledge that, yes, everyone would be better off if they did do that, at least. But some people will want and need to go further. But the real thing about compounding is you go, oh, wow, well, if you just put in £100 a month now, then blah, 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 and you'll have hundreds of thousands of pounds. But if you actually go and look at the curve and you see how this works out year by year, you see that it is ridiculously backloaded. If you just do it for 10 years, you end up with an amount where the vast majority is just what you put in yourself. The compounding bit, the interest on interest, really very little. Even after 20 years, not very much. It's only after 30 years that it really, really builds up and you start to see the power of this engine. This is why Warren Buffett is so rich. It's because he's made 95% of his money after the age of 60. But that's because he's 95 now. He's actually more than that. He's had more than 35 years of compounding, even since traditional retirement age. When you let things compound for that long, then it is incredibly powerful. So if you went back to 20 years old and started putting money away in that way, that's amazing. But what if you're only starting to think about money and personal finance and all that stuff in your 40s? Then it's not that useful because you can't go back in time and compounding won't have done so much for you by the time you hit retirement age. What if you want to get there faster? What if you want to be in a position to quit work or whatever when you're 50? Then compounding probably won't work quickly enough for you. And what if the numbers that we're all putting into our models about the returns we're going to get are overly ambitious. And this comes back into all the economic stuff and how the world has changed. But without boring on about it now, I think it's highly likely that the returns we'll see over the next couple of decades will be lower than we've seen over the last couple. So hopefully you can see, Rob, I'm not saying, oh no, the whole thing's rubbish, you should just ignore this. No, don't ignore it. Take advantage of it. But for all these reasons and more, you might be wanting to do more than that. You might be wanting to. That might be enough. But by tackling this in the book, I'm trying to help people put this all into context and go like, this is what I think this is going to do for me. Is it going to do for me? And am I happy with that? Or do I want to do something more or something different?
I actually do agree with what you've put, Rob, in the book. I think the headline grabs you, but the case you make is a very strong case. I think in life, a lot of us go into autopilot in all areas of our life, but we do investment as well. And it's the autopilot that we've been given. It's the narrative that we are told, just like the narrative of go to school, get a good job, then put money away, and in the long term, you'll be fine. It's just these things that are said, and we say things like compound interest is great for you. And for some people, it is. But for others, it's not enough, as you've said. And I think it's this narrative that we just all repeat in all areas of our life, but with this is a book about investment. And that's what I love about this book and how it's challenging you. I was going to say this near the end, but I think it's worth to bring up now. This book reminds me of, and you've referenced it already, Rich Dad, Poor Dad in a way, or Millionaire Fastlane, because they were both books that woke me up a bit. And they are both books that challenge the norm, but in a common sense way where it's hard to disagree with what's in there. And I think that's what you've achieved with this book, Rob. I probably should have saved that for the end, but I think that's the biggest compliment I can give you, because I think they're the two most impactful books I've read with investment, and I definitely lump this in with that company. And that for me is a wonderful achievement, because it seems like it's easy to do because you're writing about common sense things. I don't think there's anything in the book that people are going to read and go, oh, that is completely new. I couldn't get my head around that before, and now I can. I think everyone, certainly podcast listeners at least anyway, will be going, yes, there'll be a lot of yes, there'll be a lot of head nodding. But that clarity, that being awake, I think is so important, that alertness to life. And we tried to do this on the podcast last week where we talked about why property is great. I think everybody who listens to this podcast can get behind that property is a great investment. But it's reminding everybody why it's great and waking people up. And I think this book wakes people up to investment and takes those blinkers off and helps people see, wait a minute, there's a load of crap out here that we're just being fed. And actually, sometimes I'm repeating. And this book gives you that shake that we all need.
That was very much the idea. And just to be clear, I'm not saying you should chuck away all this stuff about investing. You shouldn't bother with a pension or an ISA or all this. And you should go and invest in property and start a business and all this stuff. And absolutely not. Because I think another flaw that you see with a lot of books, and I've studied a lot of the books that are out there, pretty much all of them when I was planning this one, is that someone will say, this is what worked for me, therefore you should do it too. And I think that's a big problem as well. Because the way I think about money is like money is an output. Money is the end result of everything that we do and all the decisions we make and the skills we have and how we spend our time. And because we're all different, we've got different preferences and goals and skills and everything else, it's impossible to be prescriptive about a plan that will work for everyone. So I could say, well, investing in property and having a business worked for me, so you should too. But that wouldn't work for 90+% of other readers. So what I put together in the book is deliberately something that gives you the underlying logic, and it gives you a framework for how to make the decisions about what you should be doing without saying this is what you should be doing. So it could be that following the typical path, doing all the normal kind of stuff is exactly the right thing for you to be doing. And if you get to the end of the book and that's the conclusion, then for me, that's still brilliant, because now you're doing it in the full knowledge that that's the right thing for you to be doing, rather than just following the default.
I'm going to make some obvious statements now, Rob, but property is investing. But this is the property podcast. So let's get into our core subject here. Is property left out this book? Does it get a mention? I kind of know the answer, but I wanted you to talk about it because it is important. We are biased, obviously. We're 10 years deep into a property podcast. But as an investment asset, it is really important. It's not for everyone, and we know that. We talk about that on the podcast all the time, and you're not suggesting that in the book as well. But if it is something that might suit you, it's an incredible asset.
It is, and I try to tone it down a little bit for the book just because I'm aware of coming across as too biased. And again, definitely don't want to say this is what everyone should do, because one of the things I talk about is that actually being happy and being confident in your plan is important. If you just flat out cannot stand the idea of property or any other investment, then you should not be doing it. Even if you knew for sure it would give you the best financial return, you should just stay miles away from it. But hopefully everyone listening will be warm to the idea of property. And the good news for property investors, as you might expect from this book, is that I think within the framework I lay out, you can be more enthusiastic about property than ever before. It doesn't mean you have to go all in on property and ignore other investments, but property thrives, for me, in two different ways. The first is the economicsy part. So again, we'll go into it fully in the book, but the way the world has changed, what inflation is likely to look like in the future, etc., etc. I think property is extremely well set up to take advantage of that. But also property fits into that third bucket that I mentioned, the one that's often ignored, the drive to improve your life. Yes, of course, you can buy a couple of properties and end up using the income to be able to retire off, and that is great. And that is something that property offers too. But it also, thanks to the leverage component, has some of the characteristics of an investment that can greatly improve your life from where it is now. And in the book, I run through various types of investment that have these characteristics, different things that you can be doing. But for me, and I don't say this so explicitly in the book, property stands ahead of the others for most people, I would say, because it feels like something that most people can understand, most people can do without having to completely upend their lives. And the risks that you have to take with property, the risks are very much there, but they feel very controllable. And maybe it's just because we've been doing this for so long, we've got a deeper understanding of it. And if you'd been spending 10 years doing something else, you'd feel that those risks were more controllable. But overall, Rob, I'd say that any property investors reading this book won't be going, oh no, I made a terrible mistake. I need to sell all my property. I think probably quite the opposite. I think they'll probably feel quite validated by the decisions that they're making.
I hope so, Rob, otherwise we might fall out. Now, I want you to have a think. I want you to visualise our podcast listener. They've gone to a bookstore or Amazon, they've gone and purchased a book. Hopefully they've done that already, but if they haven't, hint, hint. And they have read it. They've finished it, they've put it down, and they sit back. What are they thinking? What have they learned from that experience of reading your book, or how do they feel afterwards? Of course, you're not going to be able to follow everybody around to get that reaction. So what do you hope is achieved with this book? What do you hope that the feeling is and the core lessons people have absorbed when they finally put that book down?
Well, that is a great question. Well, I'm thinking about listeners of this podcast specifically, because I think there'll be some people where some of these ideas are newer. I would say for podcast listeners, though, I don't think there's going to be new information that turns their life upside down. But I think what it will do, and what I hope it will do, is put everything into context and take some of the things that you already knew, ideas that you already had, things that you picked up from elsewhere, but really pull it all together and put it into a context that you can make sense of. And that includes everything around money: earning, saving, and investing. They're basically the three ingredients. The part when it comes to earning money, I actually had to fight with the publishers to have this part in there. But for me, you've got to pull it all together. It doesn't make any sense to just separate out one bit of money because everything works together. So for me, what I hope people will have is this big picture overview. Lots of different little things will slot into place. Everything will finally make sense. And it will either validate their current plan or it will allow them to make a few tweaks, make some changes, and then have a plan that they can then execute with complete confidence that it is the right thing for them to be doing. But I think more than that, Rob, I hope that what people will get to the end of this book feeling is excited. Because something that I really try to get across in the book, and something that I truly believe, and I know that you do as well, it's about taking control of your financial situation and your life and not putting the power in someone else's hands, and not taking the approach that you have to hope that the market performs in this way, or you have to hope that the government does such and such, or even in terms of your career that you hope your boss gives you a pay rise. It's about taking ownership and believing that you are calling the shots. And I try to get across in the book that's something you really can do, and you'll feel so much happier and more relaxed and more positive if that's something that you can do. That's where I want to leave people, Rob. I want to leave people feeling confident and empowered and excited. So whether I achieve that or not, well, people have to judge for themselves, but that's what I'm going for.
Well, Rob, the only way people can experience that feeling, or hopefully experience that feeling, is if they take some action, which conveniently leads us into Hub Extra. And this week, I've got an app which will help with your laundry. No, funnily enough, it's related to the whole subject of today's podcast. No prizes if you've guessed. It's your wonderful book, Rob. Where should people go to pick up your book? It is launch day. If you're listening to this on the day of the podcast, it is launch day. It's out right now. If you're a few days late, doesn't matter, take that action. Because I know you want it, Rob, but you're far too humble to say. So as a friend, I'm going to say it. I want to see this in the top 10. And I don't mean the top 10 on Amazon, because you're going to do that. I want to see this be another Sunday Times bestseller. And just wanting it doesn't make it happen. But you've got an incredibly supportive community here. You've got a lot of listeners who are listening right now. And I know they want to enjoy this book, and they will, but they'll do it anyway just through support to back the 10 plus years that you've put into this podcast and spend a few pounds on a book. I think that's a fair trade. So now I've done the bit for you so you don't have to be uncomfortable. I've done the friend part. You do the where do we go part.
Thank you for that. So the book is called 7 Myths About Money and the Truth About Finding Financial Freedom. It's out in hardback. Can you hear that? Got it right here. It's out in hardback. You've also got the digital edition and the audiobook, which I read myself. It's out on all of those formats right now. So you can go to Amazon, go to Audible. You can walk into Waterstones. It should be there. If not, give them hell, but it should be there. But yeah, the book is in all those places, in all those formats right now. And yeah, most of all, Rob, I just want people to enjoy it and do something with it. Because that's the whole point of a self-improvement, personal development kind of book, right? Books like that should be judged by if they actually help you make a positive change in your life. And that's what I hope and believe this book will do.
I've got a suggestion. Buy one for yourself and then buy another copy for someone who needs this book. You all know somebody in your life who needs these lessons, who wants help. The way Rob writes is in such an accessible way that this could be the catalyst to getting them to change. We all know that person. Go and buy a second copy and give it to them. That is a very, very, very early Christmas gift, but or a very late Christmas gift, depending on how you want to look at it. But it's a gift, and it really would be a gift, because I think you are converted, people listening. You get it. You want more, and I hope you get more, because you think differently. By listening to this podcast, you are different, and that is brilliant. You want more than the average, and that is amazing. But most people are trapped, and help people by, we say, share the podcast, and hopefully the podcast has been passed to people. Maybe you're one of those people listening now that used to think a different way and now you think differently. Amazing, well done you. But give this book as a gift to others to help them unlock a different world, because when you start to think differently about money and investment, everything changes. And you don't become rich overnight, but you can fundamentally change the path in your world. You can go from a struggle into later life into an abundance in later life. And it doesn't have to be at retirement either. It can be a lot sooner. There are lots and lots of people listening to this podcast. We've showcased them many times over that have been wildly successful, a lot earlier in life as well. And that's because they took action, because they did things differently. So give that book to someone, get them to start thinking differently. And if they do, you've got someone else in your world who thinks like you as well, which can only be a good thing.
Well, thank you, Rob, for that suggestion, which I'm certainly not going to disagree with. And thank you to you for listening. I know lots of people listening have pre-ordered the book. So if you have, it should be dropping through your letterbox right now. So I hope you enjoy it. And I hope you'll join us back here next week, because it's a big one. It's our predictions episode for 2025. Our predictions last year? Not bad. Some that we'd rather forget about, but enough good ones in there that I think we're going to get away with it, and we're going to do it for another year. How will we fare this time? What do we believe is on the cards for property in 2025? Well, join us next Thursday to find out. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.